So this is another stream of consciousness video as I'm out walking the dog. I've been thinking recently, isn't it fascinating how certain psychological concepts and ideas can find their way from the profession of psychology or the social sciences more generally. They can find their way into the cultural zeitgeist and can be taken up by people in how they understand themselves, how they relate to one another, and can influence the culture as a whole. And it's a fascinating thing that happens that can create a feedback loop of sorts. Like sometimes this can be a good thing as it improves people's mental health, arguably, and in other ways it can maybe be taken up in a way that has unintended negative consequences, or it's taken up in a distorted form that creates problems as well. But there's a book that I came across years ago when I had some inklings or suspicions that my field, my profession of psychology is not as rock solid a science as people would like to claim. And the book that I came across is called Social Sciences as Sorcery. I think it was actually published in the late 70s. I'm pretty sure the guy's name was Stanislav Andreski, but if you can get your hands on that book, it's out of print right now, but it is absolutely fierce and scathing in its criticisms. It is witty and humorous, and for the most part it's right on point, although, you know, in some cases he misses the boat maybe. But one of the things that he points out is just this issue where the object of investigation in, you know, the science of psychology, let's say, the interpretations that we scientists make is then taken up by the object of investigation in such a way that it perhaps alters their behavior and thereby influences what the social scientists then go on to see in their investigations. So he contrasts that to something like, you know, chemistry or physics, and he kind of humorously poses, well, what would it be like if, you know, the atoms under investigation, like in our interpretation of them, you know, it changed how they saw themselves and they altered their behavior and so on and so forth. So it just points out that, you know, the science involved here is of an entirely different sort and something that we do want to appreciate. But there's all kinds of examples of this, and in the comments I'd love people to chime in, like any concepts, any ideas, any interpretations or jargon, catchphrases that obviously have like a certain psychological root, but have made their way into the zeitgeist in ways that is maybe naive or superficial, or maybe it's helpful, or maybe in other ways it's not. But one such phenomenon that I wanted to talk about here today is that of interpersonal boundaries. So this has been an idea that's been around at least since the 1980s, but I have found that it's come up so much in recent months. People talking about, you know, respecting my boundaries, asserting my boundaries, practicing setting my boundaries, and so on and so forth. And what I want to suggest is that there are places where this is perfectly healthy and good, and it's important, and, you know, places where if people don't have interpersonal boundaries, it's going to create problems. But there are other circumstances or contexts where you don't want to be doing that as a first resort. In fact, you want that to be the last thing that you try to put in place. It's a last resort. So let's talk about what we might have in mind when we look at boundaries. So setting a boundary, just think about like what that typically means in our everyday understanding of the world. It means like a barrier. It means like a wall. Maybe it's a line drawn in the sand, you know, something like that. Thou shalt not cross. So it is, you know, an attempt to assert a division between yourself as an autonomous person and other people whom you might come in contact with in particular ways. So I would say that, you know, a clear example of where this is healthy and good and appropriate would be, let's say, in a workplace situation. So when you employ a boundary in a workplace situation, you're prescribing or proscribing a set of behaviors for another person. You're saying, look, I'm going to need you to stop doing this, or I'd like you to start doing something else. So you're setting a limit on the kinds of behaviors or actions that you will accept or tolerate, And again, in a workplace setting, that might be appropriate. Let's look at why. In a workplace setting, it is likely the case that you are dealing with mere acquaintances. People typically who you don't have a friendship with, that you don't have any deep, meaningful, emotional connection to. It's people that you're working together with, for the sake of achieving some joint goal or task or earning an income or whatever that might be. And so, when you set a boundary, what that tends to involve, what that tends to mean, and we can kind of look at the phenomena by peeling back the layers, like what are we doing exactly when we set a boundary? I would suggest that what we're doing a lot of the time is we're setting a limit on another person's behaviors or what we will find acceptable in order to prevent a situation where we might feel disrespected or upset or overwhelmed or mistreated in some way where there's a distressing feeling about it. And so the boundary setting in this case, it safeguards or protects one from, finding themselves in a situation where they're dealing with these uncomfortable feelings. And so that's what the boundary setting does. Now, why is that important in like a workplace setting or something like that? Well, the other person doesn't necessarily have the right or the privilege of knowing your innermost thoughts and feelings. You're not going to necessarily trust them with that, trust that it will matter to them, trust that they'll be moved by that in some significant way, where they'll want to alter their behavior and all the rest of it. So, you don't really make much, if any, appeal to the underlying emotions at play, but rather, just setting the boundaries, setting the behavior that you're willing to accept or tolerate. You're putting the other person on notice. And implied there is often a threat, right? So in a workplace setting, it might be something like, well, Jim, if you continue to steal my stapler from my desk, there's going to be an issue. You're not to do that, right? Or you're not to. I noticed that you took my idea in this conference and you passed it off as your own. I'm not going to put up with you doing that again. If you do that again, we're going to have a problem. And when you say something like, and this is maybe more of a firm way of setting a boundary with someone. You can do it in maybe a softer way. I'd like you to not touch my arm in the workplace setting. There's a professional setting. It's inappropriate. Please don't do that. So we're setting the boundary. We're not disclosing the feelings that are at play there, and in my opinion, that is perfectly appropriate. Now, I'll notice as an aside, like people who are good at asserting boundaries, oftentimes they're able to connect with a little bit of that assertive energy that would open themselves up in a way where they can do that with ease, as opposed to anxiously kind of white-knuckling it through the actions of saying what one needs to say, let's say, in those situations. Now, let's contrast boundary setting in the way that I just described under those circumstances or in that context. Let's contrast that to like a meaningful interpersonal relationship, whether that be with family members perhaps, or whether that be with a best friend, certainly, and definitely in a romantic relationship. So what I've noticed, and this is the kind of thing, the mistake, in my opinion, and psychology is it's a tricky thing where I don't think you can avoid inserting certain values or beliefs into your understanding of what it is to be a person and how we ought to act and so on and so forth. Again, one of the reasons why psychology is not an objective science. So I know that as I'm expressing my thoughts and intuitions about this sort of thing, I'm introducing my values. I know that. I'm aware of that. I think it's unavoidable, but I'll make an argument for it if I can. So what I notice is, people in their interpersonal relationships, like in a romantic relationship, I see people asserting boundaries in their relationship all the time. And, they'll say things like, well, it's, I don't want you, seeing people outside of the relationship, if they're in a heterosexual relationship. I don't want you seeing, members of the opposite sex, and hanging out with them in that way, like especially when I don't know this person, and in such a way that it seems to kind of blur some notion of what the relationship is and so on. Like that's a boundary for me. I'm not going to put up with that. That's not going to be okay with me. So people will do that sort of thing. Or conversely, the same person might say, well, look, it's a boundary for me to have someone else tell me who I can or I can't associate with or hang out with or spend time with. And if you're going to keep insisting in that way, that's a hard boundary for me. And perhaps the relationship needs to end as a result. Now, so both people are asserting their boundaries. They're talking about what behavior is or isn't acceptable to them. And there's no disclosure of the underlying feelings at play. So, in my opinion, this is a problem because a relationship ultimately, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, it is ultimately based on that emotional connection, that felt understanding, and so on and so forth. Just another example of this sort of thing, like someone might say to themselves perhaps that, well, it's a boundary, for me not to be the one cleaning up the kitchen all the time and emptying the dishwasher and so on. So I've told myself that, and I'm going to refrain from cleaning up the kitchen every other night. And so they keep to that boundary. But they don't disclose that to their partner, let's say. And in that case, that would strike me as passive-aggressive. Like you're probably irritated or angry with your partner, your significant other. And rather than disclosing that to them or talking about how it makes you feel, you're asserting a boundary. It could also be in a more overt way. You're not to leave the dishes on the counter. If you keep doing that, we're going to have an issue here, or I'm not going to accept that. Again, on some level, that kind of makes sense, but it's a missed opportunity, really. It would be better. So again, the boundary, if we say, okay, in the absence of that boundary, how are you feeling? Okay, that would be a better place of coming at it. And, it might be, well, gosh, I'm feeling disrespected, I'm feeling hurt, or in the case of the relationship issues and persons with whom someone's interacting with outside of the relationship, like maybe I feel insecure, maybe I feel, that there's things that you're going to share with other people that you're not sharing with me, and it feels threatening in some way. So there's at least the possibility of disclosing that to the other person and trusting that it will matter to them, trusting that they will care, trusting that it will move them in some way. So what happens is that, if you tell your significant other that, look, when you leave all the dishes out and you don't empty the dishwasher, like I feel taken advantage of, I feel hurt, I feel dismissed, I feel unsupported, I feel like it's just expected that I'm to do these things, and it's quite hurtful. Like it doesn't feel very good at all. Like when you disclose that to someone as a feeling, as opposed to just setting a mere boundary, the other person, again, there's an opportunity where they might feel something about that for you and with you. And hopefully, ideally, it's a feeling of empathy, compassion, a felt understanding. They kind of just tug on their heartstrings. They feel a sadness for you that this is kind of what it's been like, and so on. And from that place, that felt place of understanding, they are now moved and motivated to perhaps change their behavior if possible, or try to find some resolution so that you don't have to continue feeling that way. And it's that joint being with one another in that profound way that is doing a lot of the work. In the absence of that, again, like we just have these psychological silos that we're coexisting in, and setting boundaries, and we're not having the practice at being able to effectively experience our emotions without being completely overrun by them, put words to our feelings, and do that in the presence of someone, hopefully, who cares. Now, if you want to say, well, look, I have it on good authority and by experience that, this person, this friend, this significant other, they wouldn't care. It wouldn't matter to them. To me, that's like, well, do you want to be in that relationship, with someone who doesn't care about your feelings, who doesn't care about how these things affect you? your experience of the relationship. If it doesn't matter to them, like, why are you in this relationship, whether it's a friend or a romantic relationship? Now, there might be extreme cases or exceptions to some of what I'm talking about. Maybe there are people, for good reason, it has nothing to do with psychopathy, where they have some difficulty tuning into the emotional side of things, and you have to be a little bit more pragmatic with them. But again, that would be the exception to the rule. By and large, I think you want to try to, so context is significant. You want to, in those most meaningful relationships, lean on the emotional side, trusting that it will matter to this other person, and let that do most of the work. And the boundary setting should be, for the most part, exceptions aside, a last resort. So hopefully that makes sense. I hope that there's some insight there that you can make use of. If you hear people talking about setting boundaries and whatnot, maybe use as an opportunity to clarify, or wonder with them about what that entails. And if there are other psychological terms, jargon, concepts that you see floating around out there in the zeitgeist, and you're a little suspicious of it, or you think that it might be misused or overused or what have you, just put it in the comments below. I'm very curious to look at some of this stuff and talk about it. Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for listening.